importance is the fact that, even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection, but the fact remains that a whole projection would nonetheless be made. The key to creating any hologram is that energy in motion must interact with energy in a state of rest. In the foregoing example,
what defines a magnet is not objective and substantial. It is not quantitative, it is qualitative. Before a magnet becomes a magnet, say this is a sphere magnet. Before a magnet becomes definitionally a magnet and has its all fancy phenomena around it, it is quantitatively 100% identical before as after. Since it is, of course, qualitative, what is the qualitative nature that then defines that thing that we call a magnet? It is a point source object all of a sudden. Same distinction between a light bulb and a laser. These are constructive and destructive lines of interference. See, everybody's fascinated by the lobal magnetic field, which is ambidextrous to the magnet. Like, ooh, I can feel these two magnets pulling towards one another, which is not magnetism at all, rather dielectric acceleration. Or I can feel them pushing apart if I have two like poles trying to face each other, which actually is magnetism in that case. Here we're actually looking, of course, at an hourglass, a sand in an hourglass. You can't take this analogy too far. But this is the actual engine of each and every magnet on Earth. And it's something that you never read in any book, your teacher never taught you, and is the power and energy and capacitance of every magnet. And it is hyperboloidal, or hourglass shape. The inverse image of a torus, i.e. the geometry of magnetism, is hyperboloid. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, in the case of magnetism, the hourglass came first. The geometry of the hourglass, which is the dielectric. The magnetic field, of course, you have to imagine the lobal magnetic field of the cross-section of the torus on either side of this hourglass. Those, of course, are the vectors of force and motion, i.e. the vectors of creation of space. The cross-section of the glass came first. The geometry of the hourglass, which is the dielectric. The magnetic field, of course, you have to imagine the lobal magnetic field of the cross-section of the torus on either side of this hourglass. Those, of course, are the vectors of force and motion, i.e. the vectors of creation of space. This is the engine of every magnet, is the hyperboloidal geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration. And of course, an hourglass doesn't work like this. I'm only showing the hourglass because it has that geometric shape of the hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape. But in the case of a true magnet, which gives it power, since a magnet is defined by its qualitative nature of being a point source, that point source would be right here, right at the middle of the hourglass, yeah? We used to use hourglasses, of course, and still do, to measure time. We flip it over, it's a 30-minute hourglass, or big fancy ones that are hour-minute hourglass. They actually measure out the sand, so it takes an hour for the sand to trickle from one side to the other. It takes an hour. But right here in the center, there is no time, there is no space, but here is where all the energy is. If you actually take two magnets and bring them together, you get one magnet, yeah? Then you have to talk about incommensurability, which takes hours. Magnetism and dielectricity are so simple, but if you have the primer in your head and you understand it, you don't have to make thousands of videos and, endless descriptors. Things become incredibly simple in a person's mind. But if you take two magnets and put them together, then it's creating one magnet. There is no magnetism right here along the center. There is zero magnetic flux. This is the plane of inertia. What's the easy way of describing the plane of inertia to someone? They'll say, they love this talking about the plane of inertia. It's the lowest pressure zone between the fight between the magnetic and the dielectric. These so-called scientists, they love talking about lines of force. The only reason why they talk about lines of force, looking at constructive and destructive interference. You see where the light exists and the dark exists and all these cross hatches.
The pebbles represent energy in motion, while the water represents energy at a state of rest. To activate, or, in effect, to perceive the meaning of a holograph, energy must be passed through the interference pattern generated by interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentov,
about lines of force. The only reason why they talk about lines of force, looking at constructive and destructive interference. You see
pattern generated by interaction between the moving energy in motion, while the water represents energy at a state of rest. To activate, or, in effect, to perceive the meaning of a holograph, energy must be passed through the interference pattern generated by interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In
between the magnetic and the dielectric. These so-called scientists, they love talking about lines of force. The only reason why they talk about lines of force, looking at constructive and destructive interference. You see where the light exists and the dark exists and all these cross hatches. Yep, that's the fight. You have one object with two expressions, the yin and the yang, which are both one. Ice and water are not two different things, they're both one thing. Magnetism and dielectricity are not two different things, they're one thing. But one has a completely different attributional nature. And human beings, likewise, in their grand ignorance, that's magnetism! Over here we have dielectricity. Yeah, ice and water, same thing. You know, we got different names for them because they have different attributional natures. One's hard and cold. The other one's wet and soft. Yeah. Same thing with magnetism and dielectric. This is the fight. The fight, of course, this is looking at one pole of a magnet right here. Yeah. The place where there's the lowest fighting going on between the magnetic and the dielectric, i.e. between centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence, i.e. increasing inertia and acceleration right here to the null point between the two where there is no magnetism, yet this is the highest energy point in any magnet. If you draw a box around this hourglass shape and talk about the magnetic field and the dielectric field, of course the hourglass, of course, is a dielectric geometry. The lowest fight zone, if you will, kind of like a neutral zone, right? Star Trek. Neutral zone is right here, as human beings love to call it, plane of inertia, right here. Yeah. Centrifugal divergence here, centripetal convergence here and here. And the place for the lowest pressure fighting going on, and I use fight in a very loose sense, it's not literally a fight, between the yin and the yang fight, actually not a fight, is right here. And the same thing on this hourglass here. There's no magnetism, there's counter space, there's all energy, there's all potency, there's no polarity here, there's no magnetism here, there's absolute energy and capacitance here. Acceleration is a vector, but it's the vector of counter space. Force is a vector of what as well. Here we have the increasing inertia and acceleration, increasing force and motion of centrifugal divergence, which of course is also a vector. But that vector is directed at the creation of space. Space is a negative image of this point right here. What is the absolute, just think about it a second, it'll become abundantly clear. What is the absolute negative of, inverse, opposite of pure potential, highest energy, no magnetism, no flux? What's the absolute inverse of that? Let's take like the softball-sized lump of uranium or plutonium. Let's make that analogous to the middle point of the hourglass here. What's the absolute opposite of that? The mushroom cloud, right? Which is what? Force, motion, chaos, space. Creates an enormous spatial donut. Huge spatial donut, if the atmospheric conditions are perfect. The volume of that donut, of course, is space, which Nikola Tesla told you over and over and over again has no properties. Space is not a thing. Space is the negative image of eternity. And by eternity, which I use loosely and make the metaphysical sense of eternity, is absolute pure potential. Right here is the closest analog we have to inertia, to the ether. Pure potential. No flux. Highest energy density. No magnetism is present here. You can actually take two magnets, bring them together, thereby creating one magnet, stick a very super thin Gauss probe between the two. Some of them are thin as paper. Yeah, Gauss probe. Observe no magnetic flux. Well, how's that possible? We brought two super powerful magnets together. We stuck a Gauss probe between the two. We brought them together thereby creating one magnet. Yeah, because when you brought the two together, you created not two magnets together, but just one magnet operating as a point source object. And right here, there's no magnetic flux. The opposite of this is space. Space is impotency. Space is no different than a shadow. What's the opposite of a shadow? Shadow is not a thing. Shadow is an absence of something. Space is not a thing. Space is the absence of pure potential. Of the ether, of counter space. You can say 0 point energy. I don't care what you call it. It's not a thing. Shadow is an absence of something. Is space. Space is impotency. Space is no different than a shadow. What's the opposite of a shadow? Shadow is not a thing. Shadow is an absence of something. Space is not a thing. Space is the absence of pure potential. What's the opposite of a shadow? Shadow is not a thing. Shadow is an absence of something. Space is not a thing. Space is the absence of pure potential. Of the ether, of counter space. You can say 0 point energy. I don't care what you call it. Mother Nature doesn't care, and you shouldn't care either. You should only care about the truth. Things become abundantly simple. Ask yourself the question, why is it the more powerful a magnet is, the smaller the smaller the volume of the toroidal field of the magnetism actually is? Well, the answer is really simple. Because this right here is the engine of every magnet on Earth, not the toroidal field that surrounds it. That's what people think. This is all human beings do think. Talk about magnetism. They talk about the toroidal field, which is ab extra to the magnets. Look at this magical stuff out here outside of the magnet. It's fascinating. You can feel stuff pulling, or pull metal to metal. That's the only thing people think about. That toroidal field is not the engine of a magnet. This hyperboloidal or hourglass shape is the engine of every magnet. It is Occam's razor in absolute perfection. It is simplicity personified, actually objectified. Actually, we can't say objectified since we're talking about field. You got my point on that one. I hope I made this a little bit clearer. Say objectified since we're talking about field. Occam's razor in absolute perfection. It is simplicity personified, actually objectified. Actually, we can't say objectified since we're talking about field.
In the simple example given by Bentov, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project the three-dimensional holographic image into space. As Marilyn Ferguson, editor of the Brain Mind Bulletin, tells us, another feature of a hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic photograph is stored everywhere on the plate. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Karl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram, which attunes itself to the universal hologram by the medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. With respect to states of expanded or altered consciousness, such as gateway uses, the process operates in the following way. As energy passes through various aspects of the universal hologram and is perceived by the electrostatic fields which comprise the human mind, the holographic images being conveyed are projected upon those electrostatic fields of the mind and are perceived or understood to the extent that the electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with, and therefore read, the energy carrier wave pattern passing through it. Changes in the frequency and amplitude of the electrostatic field, which comprises the human mind, determines the configuration, and hence, the character of the holographic energy matrix which the mind projects to intercept meaning directly from the holographic transmissions of the universe. Then, to make sense of what the holographic image is saying to it, the mind proceeds to compare the image just received with itself. Specifically, it does this by comparing the image received with that part of its own hologram which constitutes memory. By registering differences in geometric form and in energy frequency, the consciousness perceives, as psychologist Keith Floyd puts it. Contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. The consciousness perceives, as psychologist Keith Floyd puts it, contrary to what everyone knows is so. It may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. Contrary to what everyone knows is so. It may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. The consciousness process is most easily envisaged if we picture the holographic input with a three-dimensional grid system superimposed over it, such that all of the energy patterns contained within can be described in terms of three-dimensional geometry using mathematics to reduce the data to two-dimensional form. Bentov states that scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary go, no-go system, as do all digital computers. Of three-dimensional geometry using mathematics to reduce the data to two-dimensional form. Bentov states that scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary go, no-go system, as do all digital computers.
related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that, because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes, just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web. And so I'm left with the puzzle of trying to figure out whether I live in the matrix or not.
Wait, you're blowing my mind at this moment. So you're saying, are you saying your attempt to understand the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers?
That is correct. So,
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos?
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos?
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos.
But I have to just be silent for a minute. Equations that drive search engines and the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers.
That is correct. So,
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos?
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code?
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code, you're saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code, it's a special kind of computer code that was invented by a scientist named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. That's what...
Saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code, those strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code, you're saying it is computer code. It's computer code.
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
Cosmos.
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code.
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just...
Bentov states that scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary go, no-go system, as do all digital computers. Therefore, once it superimposes a three-dimensional matrix over holographic information it wishes to interpret, and reduces that information mathematically to two-dimensional form, it can completely process it using its fundamental binary system. Just as any computer made by the hand of man can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in the same way, perceiving by comparison only. Bentov states the proposition this way. Our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. Whenever we perceive something, we always perceive differences only. In states of expanded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain in its holistic, nonlinear, and nonverbal mode of functioning acts as the primary matrix or receptor for this holographic input, while by operating in phase or coherence with the right brain, the left hemisphere provides the secondary matrix through its binary, computer-like method of functioning to screen further the data by comparison and reduce it to a discrete, two-dimensional form. To the extent that Gateway succeeds in bringing about a refinement in energy matrix of the mind, it succeeds in expanding or altering human consciousness so that it can perceive without recourse to the intercession of the physical senses, such that ever more of the universal hologram can ultimately be perceived and understood. Marilyn Ferguson has written that the theories of Pribram and Bohm appear to account for all transcendental experience, paranormal events, and even normal perceptual oddities. She goes
there have been various models about how the cosmos is structured, over the centuries. And, at one point, people talked about the clockwork universe that we lived in. And now, the computer is often the metaphor for how the universe is structured. And Jim, I know you've done some work on this whole idea of maybe we should take that idea more seriously.
No, we shouldn't. But you forced me to a point where I have to speak. So I don't know how familiar the audience is with some of my research, but leading a group of both mathematicians and physicists about 10 years ago, we found an extraordinary result in some of the equations that are part of string theory. As I said, what I really do is I work on a subject called supersymmetry. So it's got symmetry in it, but it's got more symmetry than you probably should want to ever see. In the mathematical context of such equations, we have discovered that there are mathematical structures that are indistinguishable from error-correcting codes, as does occur in digital information transmission and establishing reliable digital information transmission. And because of this, many people have concluded that the work that I and my team completed means that the universe in which we live must resemble the science fiction movie The Matrix, where we're all some kind of simulation of some program running, and that's exciting for a lot, of people.
It's a little unnerving.
Well, and then there, of course, you have Nick Bostrom, a philosopher, who has really, put this point front and center for the public and for
who says the computers will take over.
Yeah. He basically says that we're all just simulations. I like to point out to people a couple of things with that that I find problematic with that. One is, if you accept that, then you have to also accept the existence of ghosts.
Existence of
ghosts. Edgar Allan Poe. Ghosts.
Oh, okay.
Ghosts. Right?
Why, Jim?
Because if we are simulations, there's some kind of substructure that we don't have access to that runs us as an app. So when we die, what does that mean? It means that particular app was ended. That the app stopped running. Right? But if that underlying superstructure still exists, and if there's no damage to the codeware, whoever is running this superstructure can re-enable a app, let's say Jim Gates 500 years from now. So Jim Gates comes back as a ghost. It's built into the idea that the universe is a simulation. This doesn't sound like the universe I exist in. So although many people like to say my work supports simulation theory, I actually believe that it's pointing to something far more beautiful and subtle about the nature of the laws of physics. But if that underlying superstructure still exists, and if there right, why? Then you have to also accept the existence of ghosts. Accept that, then you have to also accept the existence of ghosts.
Existence of
ghosts. Edgar Allan Poe. Ghosts.
Oh, okay.
Ghosts. Right?
Why, Jim?
Because if we are simulations, there's some kind of substructure that we don't have access to that runs us as an app. So when we die, what does that mean? It means that particular app was ended. That the app stopped running.
She goes on. Marilyn Ferguson has written that the theories of Pribram and Bohm appear to account for all transcendental experience, paranormal events, and even normal perceptual oddities. She goes on to say of Pribram, currently he is proposing a startling, all-encompassing model that is generating considerable excitement among those intrigued by the mysteries of human consciousness. His holographic model marries brain research to theoretical physics. It accounts for normal perception and simultaneously takes the paranormal and transcendental experiences out of the supernatural by explaining them as a part of nature. Like certain strange discoveries of quantum physics, The radical reorientation of this theory suddenly makes sense of paradoxical sayings of mystics throughout the ages. To complete our outline of the process by which the mind achieves and exercises consciousness, we must also describe the mechanism which accounts for the aspect of human thought that differentiates it from the consciousness of plants or animals, i.e., self-cognition. Humans not only know, but they know that they know. They are able to monitor the process of their own thinking and maintain an awareness of it. Moreover, they can conduct a comparative assessment, evaluating the functioning of their thought processes against various objective standards they have adopted. Human consciousness can do this because it has the capacity to duplicate aspects of its own hologram, project them out, perceive that projection, put it through comparison with the memory aspect of its own hologram, and measure or sense. The difference is using three-dimensional geometry, and then binary go, no go, pulse to yield verbal cognition about the self. Thank you for watching. Be sure to check out the next installment of CI Declassified, where we will be reviewing the following topics: time, space, dimension, intervening dimensions, subatomic particles, dimensions in between, out-of-body experience, absolute and perspective, toroidal fields, quality of consciousness, the gateway method, and more. If you found this video interesting, please take a moment to leave a like and share it with someone you know.